Welcome back to the Fresh Economic Thinking podcast. Today, a special guest, Richard Tooth, to talk about something that seems quite important but doesn't get much airtime: road safety. How much risk are we taking on the road, and what can economics help us to do to minimize that risk and maximize the benefit? Richard, thanks for coming.
Hi, Cameron. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Probably the best place to start is for you to introduce yourself briefly to the audience. Why are you the person to talk to about the economics of road safety and risk? How did you get into this topic?
Well, thanks, Cameron. Well, I'm an economist and a director of a consulting firm, Superior Research Group. I spend most of my life working on economic policy and regulatory issues across a broad range of sectors, which include water, energy, insurance, transport. About 15 years ago, I started looking at road safety, and that was prompted by I had a background in measurement of quality of life and well-being, and I was a bit concerned that authorities in Australia were undervaluing the social or societal impact of road crashes. So I wrote a report on the topic, which then led to a speaking invitation, and while I was presenting those findings, someone asked me the question what I would do to address the problem. I think I, as an economist does, mumbled something about incentives, and I also, due to my background in the insurance industry, mentioned that we probably should look at the role of insurers more, which then led to more investigations, more papers, more presentations, and then discussions with road safety experts, and then submissions to various inquiries, and ultimately me here talking to you.
Right. So, but it's like many things. I think you stumbled into it and you thought, oh, gee, I really should just keep digging until I've got to the bottom. You sound very like-minded on many of those things. So maybe we should start with a ballpark. Like, what are the scale of the risks of the cost to life or the quality adjusted life years? Maybe you want to explain how you would measure that from Australians driving on the road every day, and how does that compare globally? What are we talking about here in terms of the scale of the risk?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the most common metric, of course, is fatalities on the roads. And last year in Australia, we had about 1,300 people die on the roads, which is absolutely horrific. In addition, there were about 40,000 hospitalised injuries, and 3,000
Mm.
of those are classified as severe. And so they're, very long-term impacts to people. The social impact of this is immense. And obviously, there's the people who suffer fatality or serious injury, but then there's the impact on families and friends. Young people are disproportionately affected. Yeah, I think young people are three or four times more likely to be involved in a fatal road crash than your average driver.
Hmm.
Um, and the problem, Australia, it's difficult to compare countries, of course. There's so many factors, but on an international comparison, on most measures, Australia doesn't do terribly well. We have more fatalities versus the OECD median than on a per capita basis, and I think per number of drivers, registered vehicles basis. So, and the progress in reducing that road toll has actually declined or stagnated. So we had a big improvements, from the 1980s, and and then down all through the beginning of the 21st century, there was declines, and then I think up until around about 2015, it's been fairly stagnant as the amount of the improvement that's occurred. I mean, of course,
Yeah,
during that
right.
time, the number of vehicles and the population's increased, but still the reduction's been very disappointing.
So, wow. Okay. So, in terms of a lay of the land, we had a huge gains in the 80s, a little bit more gains in the 90s, but essentially not much. And then since the last decade, things have gone backwards in terms of annual road deaths, roughly.
Wouldn't say backwards, but just say stagnated.
So
In
it's
terms of the total roll toll, in terms of the per capita population, there's been some slight increase, but I think every person who works in road safety would say it's way
Right.
the progress has been way less than what we'd like.
And is that a global trend of the sort of the end of progress on road safety, or is Australia sort of leading that
Yes,
reduction in progress? How do we
I
fit?
think there are common issues around the world. There has been yeah, a reduction in the progress. I mean, I think there was big changes with improvements in safety in vehicles, particularly in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Mhm.
But then progress has, yeah, I think stagnated in quite a few countries around the world, and it varies quite a lot. But yeah, it's just a
Yeah.
massive societal problem.
So I want to, before we sort of get on to what can we do and what drives, what causes, uh, road fatalities and injuries, I want to just reiterate that number. You said 40,000 injuries on the road, motor vehicle related. So it's not people tripping on the gutter when they're walking to school and stuff, or is this all sort of transport on the road injuries?
I think it's all transport related, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
It would include pedestrians who are hit by motor vehicles, but the actual categorization,
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure. I mean,
Yeah. But it's 40,000 injuries and 1,300 deaths. So that's, what is that? Three and a bit per day, every day of the
I
year.
mean, it's
And
horrific. A good day is when three people die on the roads. It's just horrific.
And what's the typical age? Because as you mentioned in your introduction, you were studying well-being and the quality of life. Am I right to assume that the average age of a road fatality is much younger than, for example, a death from a heart
Yes.
attack or heart disease or all these
Yeah.
other things where we devote billions in resources to studying these causes of death to delay the death of a 75 or 80-year-old? And yet here we have perhaps a mean age at death on the road of 20 something. And so each of those deaths is costing 50 plus life years, whereas a preventable death from heart disease is taking 5 life years. So it's actually, in comparison to other causes of death, in terms of life lost, pretty high. It's like those childhood diseases that used to kill a lot of people. Am I right? Have you done any sort of comparative calculations on that?
I haven't worked out what the mean average fatality age is, but broadly you're right. I mean, I think it'd be higher than the 20s. So there are a lot more older drivers on the road. So, young
Mm,
drivers are disproportionately affected. But it's interesting if you were to do a graph, and this was in my original 2010 paper, if you did a graph of the percentage of fatalities from road accidents by age, and then map that to the percentage of all fatalities. Of course, you get much disproportionately higher percentage of fatalities in for young people, and compared to the number of all fatalities, and then it completely reverses when people get old, because the fatality rate for very old people goes up significantly
yeah.
from all causes, but from road causes it becomes very low. And so, I mean, the way I put it, if the parent's worst nightmare, of losing a child, losing a teenager, the chances are
Mm.
that's going to be coming from a road fatality, from a road crash.
Yeah, I don't think we understand that that's right. It's one of those, if you have a teenager or a young adult child die, it's most likely from a road crash. And we know it's common because in every film, when you need a backstory of someone who's got a terrible injury or died young, oh, they died in a road accident. It's
Yes.
like just this default way that we sort of knock people off randomly from society and accept it. And so to just get to the point, where could we be? What would be a sort of world's leader in low rate road fatalities? We've got 1,300 per year. Would it be half that or less than half if we were comparable with the safest sort of road
In the
systems in the
again,
world?
it depends on the metric that you use, but I think the safest countries, I think you'd be, I think somewhere like Iceland, where there's an awful lot less driving. But I mean, so much depends on the demographics. You know, the degree of urbanization is a huge factor, for instance. But if we were world leading on a per capita basis, I think we'd probably be in the order of a 40, 50, maybe a 40% reduction in fatalities. I
Okay.
suspect that'd be the case. But don't quote me on that figure.
So we got like a one or two people per day per every day we could sort of save um, throughout the year
The,
if we did something differently. So why don't we talk about what we might do differently? Because as an economist, I'm very wary that we actually get benefits from driving. So it's not that we want it to be completely riskless. We want to be able to get around and use the roads and transport goods and transport ourselves. But where do the risks mostly come from in driving? How do we sort of mentally think about what the major risks are and how to sort of prioritize where we might address them? Do you understand? That's
yeah,
not a
so
very
actually,
clear question.
it's probably worth just picking up on a very good point that you made is that we do need to worry about the costs, and if we didn't worry about the costs, solving road safety would be dead easy. We'd just ban cars. We'll make people drive at 20 kilometers an hour. I mean,
Exactly.
yes. And this is gets the very big frustration is so many road safety programs and policies, there isn't a focus on costs, and then there's the inevitable pushback, and it becomes a difficult conversation. So we need to talk about costs, and we need to think about, where do you get the best bang for your
Mm.
buck in terms of reducing the risks, the cost to society at the lowest cost.
Yeah,
And
so I
that's
have in
where,
mind you've got
yeah,
two lists. On one side, you've got what are the high risk parts of driving, and then you've got on the other side a list of costs associated with reducing those risks, and you want to sort of match them up and go with the ones with the highest ratio, the highest benefit cost ratio, and start there. Is that? No, I mean that's the economic way of thinking.
broadly, that's just, yeah,
Yeah.
that's classic economics. Now, the way I look at it is I think, well, there's a number of factors which influence, the likelihood of a road crash. And so there's the infrastructure side of things. So, the better roads, but
Hmm.
you can get improvements there. But then there's an awful lot of decisions that individuals make, and that tends to be where I focus, which is, and you can broadly categorize it as three decisions: whether you drive, so it's late at night, do use the
Hmm.
metro, or do you drive out? What you drive, how heavy a car are you using, what safety features are in the car, and then how you drive, how fast you drive, how much you brake, accelerate, etc. And to my mind, the biggest bang for buck is focusing on the incentives of drivers, basically their decisions as to whether, what, and how they drive. And that's where I feel we have the biggest issues.
Right. So often you hear that it's an engineering problem. If we had safer roads, people would be safer. But you're saying that actually that is a high cost way to reduce fatalities because you end up sort of over investing in things for such low probability behaviors. Whereas if you change the incentive for the driving behavior itself, you would actually just reduce the probability directly by having people drive differently, drive different cars, etc. Is that the basic argument?
Broadly, and it's all
Okay.
relative, of course. So there's always
Uh-huh.
benefits to better infrastructure, but on yeah, bang for the buck. Yeah, I think focus on the incentives.
Okay. So how do we do that?
Yeah.
Maybe as a preface, I might say, I might ask a bit of another lay of the land question. In a lot of parts of society and a lot of markets, there's this power law rule, like an 80-20, and people will see it at work. 20% of the workers do 80% of the work. Um, is it the case in driving where we have a sort of relatively sort of long tail of high risk drivers where we need to focus on and the sort of bulk of people are reasonably safe? Or is it much more random and hard to know when it comes to road safety risk?
A bit of both. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned, I think young drivers are 3 to 4 times more likely to have be in the have a fatal road crash. And obviously there are sort of various high risk groups, that you can target, and obviously there are people who drive less safely. They drive in higher, less safe vehicles. So there are, yes, certainly a risk-based approach you would have
Hmm.
is better than a blanket, blunt approach. So you
Hmm.
can, but there is sort of limits to that. I mean, everyone, you and I are at risk on the roads. Everyone can improve the safety of how they drive. So, um, yeah, it's a bit of both, but
So how do we go about changing, if we're not going to change the engineering of the roads, we want to change the incentives of people who use
yeah.
them. Where do we start? This is, I'm an
Well,
economist. I want to hear.
a useful a useful starting point is just let's talk about the incentives. And
Mm,
so, um, and this is where, I mean, from an economist perspective, it gets incredibly interesting. And obviously, we've got an incentive to save our own lives. So, you know, we don't want to take risky behaviour because we want to protect ourselves. We
hmm.
also obviously want to protect our loved ones. So, if I'm driving my kids, I am very, very concerned about the safety, and more so, I'm concerned about them than my own life. Um, Now, but there is some real issues in the incentives. And number one is there's an interesting behavioural issue, which is that if you survey people, it turns out that most people think that they're a better driver than average. And of course, that's a statistical impossibility. So, so we tend to be realistic on a number of things, but we're all better drivers than average, apparently. So there's that issue. I think we tend to a lot of people tend to undervalue their life in as well, and particularly for young people, I don't think they appreciate. Well, I mean, I certainly didn't how much my parents would care for me, and so they even when they taking their risky behaviour, they're not taking factoring the impact they would have on family and friends for their behaviour.
Oh,
But
so
then there's
they're
some.
people. So you're saying people will drive by themselves a little riskier because they don't really care that much if they die, relative to what they should because of the impacts on all their family and friends when they're
Use.
gone.
And
Wow.
if
Yeah, that
you're,
makes a bit of sense.
yes, and I mean, I'm speaking from personal experience from when I was young. I still remember, and I mean, my mother would have been horrified how I might have driven on the roads. And I certainly hope that my teenage children be more careful than I was.
Yeah, right.
So
Very interesting.
the, yeah, but then there's the other issues, and this is where, yeah, from a economist perspective, it gets particularly interesting. So our incentive for not taking risks, um, impacts on other people, largely, there's a financial incentive that happens. So if I were to damage your car, I would be liable for the compensation to fix your car.
Hmm.
And so if I caused $5,000 damage to your car, you could rightly ask me for that $5,000 to fix the car and plus any inconvenience. Um, and that gives me, if I know I'm going to get caught and be found at fault, that gives me a good incentive and actually the optimal incentive to avoid doing that damage. Now, I'm typically insured, and then the insurer takes on that financial liability, but then the insurer has the incentive to encourage me to be safer. But this
Hmm.
is where it starts to fall down. And so a vehicle can be replaced, and but people can't. And so we the damage that I can cause through a road crash is not just to another vehicle, and that can get extremely expensive. Obviously, we're talking, up to $100,000 for damage to another vehicle. But more importantly, it's the damage to human beings. Now, the compensation, the financial liability that is associated with that is much less than the value of to society of avoiding that crash in the first place. And that
Hmm.
is as though And
So
this
why is
gets
that
into
value so much less? Is it because, the medical treatments from people who don't die are sort of covered collectively through public health and therefore sort of a lifelong injury? I might pay them a little bit of money, but it might cost 5 to 10 million over a lifetime to treat that we all pay for. Is that one mechanism? Or are there other reasons that it's not enough?
the big one is that the financial liabilities associated with the compensation, which tends to
Hmm.
be around the medical loss of income, but the value that we put on preventing fatalities and very serious injuries is much, much higher. And
Uh-huh.
this is so, and give a simple example. If your road traffic authority is investigating putting a wire barrier down the middle of a road, and the
Mm.
reason why they do that, a
Divided
multi-lane
road.
road,
Yeah.
a dividing road, the reason they do that is purely from a road safety perspective. When they do that, they're working in their minds, they're doing a cost benefit analysis about how many lives we might sort of save. What's the likelihood we might sort of save a life? When they're doing that analysis here in New South Wales, they're using a figure of around $9 million for every fatality avoided,
Wow.
which is it's a big number. And we might talk about how we get to that. But
Yeah.
here's the rub: is that in the insurer, the cost to the insurer um, when a fatality occurs is much, much less. And I think for in Queensland the cost associated with a fatality is in the order of around $330,000. So we're
To an
talking,
insurer.
to the insurer. So the financial liability
Ah,
associated with a fatality is around. So we're talking 25 to 30 times less than the value that the traffic authority is using. And if you think the traffic authority is using the right value, then the insurer's incentive is around a factor of 25 to 30 times less. And that and that's the problem. And of course, then, right, you could say, well, if the insurer, and if the insurer wasn't there, then we of course have the problem that um, if I wasn't insured, I'd be personally liable. Well, most people don't have $9 million, so
no, so
you
they'd
know,
be bankrupt and it would be limited anyway.
yeah. So this is an issue what we call judgment proof, and there's a huge issue in the United States where a lot of people are uninsured,
Uh-huh.
where the people don't pursue them for the financial liability simply because they can just the chances of recovering the costs just are so slim. And here we have much better control over the insurance sector,
Mm.
so that people are insured,
Yeah.
and that becomes a really, really important factor. But still, the incentives are way, way less than they should be, and so
Yeah.
this ends up being a massive issue. But it's also useful. It's probably where useful to know where that $9 million figure comes from. Probably
Well, that's great because I literally just typed a little note. Next question. Is the
right.
$9 million figure it? How do we know that one's right? And it's not actually 330,000. Why aren't we just cheapskates? How do
Yes.
we know that the road safety authority is right and that we don't overspend on road safety infrastructure because it's visual and symbolic and politically sensitive. So it's sort of skewed the logic, by an order of magnitude too high to make it look like we're doing something for people. Whereas the economic reality would be much less. Where does that number come from, and is it right?
By the way, I'll start. But my rough estimate is too low. By the way, and the figure I used
Oh,
was New South Wales. Each state uses a different figure. But
okay. Are they
broadly, this
all
comes from,
similar?
and
Or
it
what would the
varies.
smallest one be? Like 5 million or
Oh,
much higher?
it was when I first started in this, they were using very low figures, and different jurisdictions around the world use different figures.
Wow.
And they have, I, in my 2010 report, I think I used the statement is that traffic authorities have tended to be very conservative use conservatively low figures when um, calculating this. And so that was the start of why I was concerned, is that I
Yeah.
don't think we were valuing life appropriately.
And yeah,
But
so where does it
to
come
yeah,
from?
so to where does this come from? Well, here's the first thing we should the way to explain this. We don't value a person's life. I mean, that's just morally just wrong. What we
Hmm.
do is valuing risks to life. And because we're forward looking, we're trying to what would people be willing to pay to avoid a risk to their life? And we make these decisions every day. So when you look at a crosswalk, it's safer to cross at a crosswalk than jaywalk. People every day will not walk the 50 meters to go up to the crosswalk. They will do the jaywalking, for instance. And
Hmm.
when they're making that decision, they're accepting higher risk to themselves and saving a cost. But we can actually see this in much more real examples. And I shall give you an example which actually happened to me. I had the
Okay.
I had the choice of I was flying to Cuba. I had the choice of two airlines. The cost of flying with one airline was, I think, $100 more than the other airline. And at this stage, when I was doing this, the safety records of the different airlines was available. For all intents and purposes, they were, equally good. They'd get me there roughly about the same time. I looked up the safety records, and you could actually calculate what the additional likelihood of a crash would have been. And it was in the order of something like the additional likelihood of a crash was in the order of an additional 1 in 100,000 risk of crashing if I went with a less safe airline.
Hmm.
But I would save $100.
Hmm.
I chose to go with, and I was with my fiance at the time, so I chose to go with we chose to go with the more expensive airline with the better safety record. So in now, if you multiply that $100 by the 100,000, you get to a figure around $10 million. So which kind of suggests if everyone was doing that, we were valuing on average our lives at least $10 million. Now, we're
Mm.
making lots of these decisions all the time, and you sort of see this. There's a huge field of research which looks at people's choices with risky occupations and a whole bunch of other sort of situations. And then they also do a lot of what we call willingness to pay studies. So, what would you, voice modeling type of studies where they put options in front of people and say, how much would you pay? You've got these two choices of roads. One's a toll road, but it's lower risk.
Mm.
Here's another road, which is there's a higher crash risk on this road, and which road would you choose? And when they do those surveys and calculate the results, they get to these figures of around um, $9 million. Now, there's a huge variation in these studies, but when you aggregate all these studies, and literally there's been hundreds of them, you get to these very, very large figures.
Mm.
Now, if you compare how the figures we use in Australia to say what is used in the US, we tend to be on the low side. So, uh, so that's where I sort of come to the value figure, the conclusion that our values tend to be too low.
So what would
Um,
how much lower would it be in the US? Would they be 50% higher? Would it just be kind of an exchange
I
rate
think
type?
I seem to recall they're about $10 million in US, so
Yeah,
which
okay.
is yes, 40 to 50% higher. Um,
Yeah, right.
but it's an area of great controversy, and this is where originally the original values and the values that might be used might be as low as sort of $3, $4 million in some countries. But um, I mean,
Wow.
but regardless, even if we're using a $3 million value, we're still a factor of 10 times. We've got, 10, that's 10 times the difference
Yeah.
to that financial in the incentive that exists already. So fascinating area. And by the way, obviously we can then look at the financial incentives associated with, the willingness to pay to avoid serious injuries as well as not just fatalities. And so they do this analysis. Um, but again, emphasizing it's all about what would you be willing to pay to avoid risks, and then we just aggregate that up and use a simple value.
So I guess the next question, Richard, is how do we change the incentives so that people will change their driving choices and behavior because they are facing the full risk, or um, is it the insurance company? Because my risk is limited to my asset base, right? Personally, how do we start doing that? And are there any examples where these types of things have been trialed?
Yeah. Absolutely. Very good question. So, from my investigations, I've come to the conclusion the best option looks like is going via the insurance industry and reforming the insurance industry. And
Okay.
if we don't want to put more direct financial incentive on individuals, but if we do that, put that on the insurers, and the insurance as we have is compulsory insurance, then the insurers will work their magic to influence us. And they will influence us to discourage us from driving at, at different times. They'll encourage us to drive in safer vehicles, and they'll encourage us to drive better. Now, they've always done this in some ways. They provide discounts for safer driving and a safer driving record, but their
Hmm.
technology is improving all the time as to how they can do that. And I'll sort of get to that, but first of all, what we can do is change the incentives for insurers. And to demonstrate this, it's probably useful to use an example of how it's done badly in the reverse.
Okay.
And the bad example, I have to say, unfortunately, I have to say, is Australia and each of the jurisdictions in Australia. And if we do a comparison of what happens in the UK and what happens in Australia. So in the UK, you don't buy a separate CTP insurance and a motor vehicle insurance product. You buy one product. So
Hmm.
there's still a compulsory element to it. So in total, you're still getting similar types of cover, but it's one insurance product. And there's no pricing regulations to speak of. So now in Australia, if you compare Australia to the UK, what we've done is split the insurer's incentive. So your insurance for CTP might be with a different insurer than it is for your motor vehicle. So the immediately compared to an insurer in the UK, the insurer in Australia has potentially half the incentive to make sure you drive safely. Secondly, we
Is that
regulate.
so? Let me just recap what you're saying there. You're saying because we have quite likely two different insurers, one for our compulsory third party that we pay with our rego, and one when we insure our car, both of them have half the incentive to reduce the cost of me crashing because they're only liable for a proportion of the risks to me as a person. Is that right? So if I divided that even further, if I had 12 different insurers, one for fire and theft, one for third party property, one for third party, they'd be like, oh, we're not going to do anything about his behavior because we're only saving if he, crashes into a left-handed dwarf or something. But if you're liable for every risk this driver has, you might go, oh, well, I'm going to try and change that driver's behavior and offer them a better deal for not driving at night or things like that. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Okay.
That's it.
So so
Now
you want
then,
to lump it all in so that there's a maximum relationship between the insurer and the person because you want the insurer to influence what the person does when they drive. Okay.
absolutely. And what
Okay.
and what they drive and whether they drive.
Oh, okay. So how do
Now,
they do that?
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
again, simple comparison in the UK. And now, by the way, the
Okay.
UK is not perfect, but in the UK, they also don't have pricing regulation. And so now, if you're a young driver in the UK or a young person in the UK and you're looking to drive, well, first of all, you've got much more incentive to not drive because insurance premiums are very, very high for young drivers, extremely
Mm,
high. And so you're going to go, well, the public transport's looking pretty good, or or biking or whatever. So that's the first incentive. Then the second incentive is saying, well, a young driver in the UK, they there is no way they can afford a performance vehicle. You know, they are going to, the insurers will price them out of the market to do that. They have much more incentive to buy a safer, sort of less aggressive vehicle, one that's going to cause less insurance, less bodily insurance damage cost. And then they'll also, the insurers in the UK provide greater incentive for young drivers to uh, drive vehicles which have the safety features. So now,
Mm.
in comparison, and well, there's a huge one which is around telematics usage-based insurance as well,
Oh,
and
you're gonna have
this
to explain that
yeah, I'll
one.
get this one.
Okay.
And this one is great. So this one is really a game changer. So I think around about a third of young drivers in the UK have at any one time, and we're talking very young, have a usage-based insurance product. And basically, this is where through a telematics device, which can be a device that's plugged into the the car's onboard diagnostic unit, or effectively just their mobile phone, and is tracking how they're driving. And so
Right.
then the insurer provides rewards for them for if they drive more smoothly. They basically they will provide, and different insurers provide different types of rewards, but broadly they will track how fast you're going, how fast you accelerate, and then how often you brake hard, how much you swerve, and then what time you're driving. So, for instance, in the UK, with one insurer, they penalise you quite substantially if you're a young driver with usage-based insurance for driving after 11 o'clock on a Friday night. Yes, so telematics insurers they provide a range of incentives, basically how and when you drive, and they're quite common in the UK, particularly among young drivers. But here in Australia, there is negligible uptake. And the key reason appears to be is our insurance regulation. And
Mm.
simply because we have this problem of split insurance into the motor vehicle and CTP components. The other issue we have here in Australia is that we price regulate the CTP insurance. So, and
Mm.
here's the what seems absolute madness is that doesn't matter how badly you drive in most states, in say in Queensland, you pay the same CTP insurance premium. Doesn't matter how aggressive a motor vehicle you have, you pay the same CTP insurance premium.
Yeah.
And now, and and
So
just
it's
to then, yeah,
yeah.
sorry,
It sounds like it would be even worse. For example, do you know about New Zealand's no fault national insurance
yes.
scheme? And that would be even less sort of incentive to reduce risky behaviors or behaviors that risk others. Yeah. Because yeah, maybe there's a policy incentive to minimize payouts and change things, but not a personalized individual incentive. Like,
So I
I'm not in. Yeah.
think, yeah,
What's your view on that? Is that a even worse problem or related, or am I just thinking out loud the wrong thing?
I think it's about equally bad. So,
Okay.
so certainly not much better. I think there's some part of the funding for that scheme, which is it comes um, from road user charges, which I think might be coming from a fuel levy. So that provides some incentive to reduce and also the vehicle size. So I think there is some incentive there.
Mhm.
But it's certainly not much better than Australia. And again, the use of telematics enabled usage-based insurance is negligible. Um, and by the way, just going back to that, the evidence suggests that um, the telematics usage-based insurance works.
Right.
An analysis that I've looked at suggests that I think we could bank on about a 20% reduction just from that alone.
Whoa. So half the step from where we are to world's best sort of road safety, just from that.
Also, that is from
Okay.
young drivers. Yeah.
So that would be a combination of deregulating CTP so that, yes, it's compulsory, but you have to go and choose it and you get it sort of bundled in with your own car insurance. And the incentive then for those insurers who would be insuring the young drivers whose risk of injuring a third party is many orders of magnitude higher, would you say? Is it more than 10 times higher? If you're
Oh,
sort of
so well,
17 to
there's
25?
two. So I think of this is in two step changes. The first
Okay.
change is to effectively go to the UK system, which is
Okay.
basically bundled CTP and motor vehicle insurance and no restrictions on pricing. Now, there
Uh,
is a big equity issue there that people worry about, which is, of course, is that if you go to the UK system, young people are paying an awful lot more
hmm.
for their insurance because they're higher risk. And people might be concerned about that. But that's easily addressed. You know, we can effectively what we've got right now is a cross subsidy from the safe drivers to the unsafe drivers.
Uh-huh.
And it's a ridiculously targeted cross subsidy. It's basically compared to the UK, it's kind of like the safer you are, the more you're taxed relative to the UK, and the riskier you are, the more you're subsidized relative to the UK.
Hmm.
Now, we can, if we want concerned about subsidies to young drivers, subsidize them for being young. That's easily to detect, and we can easily do that, but don't subsidize them for being young and risky. Um, so
Yeah.
so yes, we can. So first step would be to go just to the UK system, and I would suggest at the same time introduce um, some adjustments so that we address equity issues along the way,
Yeah.
and
Well,
then
that
we
was
would
my
get a
next
massive.
question. I can cross that off. I was like,
Yeah.
in Australia, people are very sensitive to equity when it comes to mobility. We don't like toll roads. That's a tax on poor
Yes.
working people, young tradies trying to get from A to B, the apprentices, and you're taxing them because they have to move for work, where all the white collar guys get to just catch their nice train at a convenient time. I can imagine a similar backlash that you've got your young apprentice in his Ford Ranger that he's just leased, and you're like, oh, sorry, your insurance is now three times more to drive that car because we're not cross subsidizing through the compulsory fixed price CTP program. Well, like, how do you, just to sort of digress for a minute,
Yeah, please.
how do you deal with the political sensitivities around that? Do you have a sort of a view on how you manage that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few things. I mean, the first thing is we should investigate this. But there's no effort in investigating this and thinking through these issues.
Hmm.
But that's that said, it's like I think these issues are well addressed through a number of ways. I mean, first of all, by the way, you give young people the incentive, and they will drive more safely. I mean, that 20% figure. I think is a very much a lower bound.
Mm.
The Yeah, I used to think about it. And if you put a series of dollar coins on the road, and ask someone, a young person, to drive down the road and running over every dollar coin, they'll be able
Mm.
to do it. If they think they're going to collect those dollar coins, they can do it. They've got the skills, to do it. It's just they just need the right incentives. So once you give them the incentive, then they can reduce their risk, which reduces their premium. But of course, you can create this program to fix up the cross subsidy. Now,
Mm.
here's another, and you can do it through a grandfathering program, which means that it's just a temporary thing, and eventually we get young drivers pay their way. And of course, by the way, no one's young forever. Unless your
Mm.
name's Peter Pan, eventually you're going to
Mm.
benefit from this. Um, so, so there is that. But I think we can certainly address the cross subsidy in a more equitable way.
Okay.
I think the other thing is that a lot of policymakers underestimate how willing the public would be to go along with such changes. And I've recently worked on another issue where in the water sector. And by the way, this would be worthy of another podcast, where effectively, a classic issue in the water sector is that during drought we underprice water. We don't
Mm,
give enough the right financial incentive to conserve water. Well, the obvious change there is basically said, well, while we're giving these additional financial incentives, we rebate some revenue so that there's no change in the average bill.
mm,
And when you package it like that and present it to customers, they go, "Yeah, that sounds great."
mm.
So people support these types of things when they see it's not just a price increase, but it's
Yeah,
a repackaging where people
yeah,
aren't gouging unnecessarily profiting. So I think the change is easily possible, and I think people underestimate how difficult the change is. There's awful a lot of situations around the world where we see when efficient price changes have been introduced, there were concerns, but very soon afterwards, the concerns have just gone away.
yeah.
And this would be
I'm
just
thinking of
another
the
one of those.
New York congestion pricing, which just came in last month, I think, right?
Yes.
The public attitude towards it has shifted, like a swing of 25 percentage points. Positively in 1 month since it was introduced. But I think you're also right in the packaging it up. So the water conservation, you say, well, we're going to try charge higher usage charges, but we're actually going to decrease your connection charge because we want the price to be based on the thing that you can vary. So we're actually giving you an opportunity to save money by changing your behavior. And this would be a similar thing is that yes, on average, young people will pay more. But guess what? If you want to do the telematics and drive carefully in a small car, you might actually save money because you'll end up on the other side of that average change. It's now your sort of opportunity to make a saving through your own sort of initiative. Would you
And
say that's a
yeah,
fair assessment?
absolutely. So
Okay.
just a couple of small things there. I wouldn't change the fixed charge for the water. I'd put it as a rebate because,
Oh, okay, okay. It's
yep.
temporary
But
because of the drought situation and not a permanent
it's
thing.
temporary, the
Yeah.
drought situation, but also so you get into a tenant landlord type of situation. One might pay the usage charge, one might
Oh,
pay
I
the
see what
fixed
you
charge.
mean.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So some matters there, but principle, absolutely. And the other thing is I think you can do it such that groups as a whole, so young drivers as a whole, are no worse off, financially worse off,
Ah,
and they should be financially better off. And why give them, why give them a subsidy for insurance? Why not just give them a transport subsidy? Or just give them cash, which is another debate. If you're going to
yeah,
subsidize young people, why subsidize them to drive? Um,
yeah.
so it's just an interesting question.
So, so I want to break this down. So we've got in your mind there. Let me just sort of wrap up where we are, and then ask my next question. In your mind, there's sort of three big ways to tackle road safety. One is in engineering, where we're willing to pay $9 million per sort of quality adjusted life year saved, whatever we add up those probabilities.
Life, not life year, but life. Yes,
Lifetime, so it's like 80
yes,
life
yeah.
years or 70 or something. And then there's this sort of incentive based way. And what's stopping there being incentives for rewarding safer choices is that we basically pay a fixed price insurance to insure others for our driving through compulsory third party. And so there's no incentive for the insurers to work with their customers to minimize their risks, and create those savings, because it's actually the insurance company that will save millions of dollars of payouts per life, um, if they can get their customers to do different things. So all that makes sense. There are equity issues because there's huge skew to younger people, but of course they're the ones whose lives are going to be saved also,
Yes.
typically. Um, so I want to then ask, so you've said driving differently and driving different cars, having this accelerometer in your phone measure if you're like racing to drag racing people off the line and braking suddenly around corners. Um, has how do we know? these things work? And what are the major changes? Is it the behavior? Is it the car choice? How much does car choice matter in terms of risks on the road? There's a lot of talk about everyone driving dual cabs utes or American
Mm.
pickups being imported. Are they big deals relative to behavioral choices, the engineering choices of the car? And maybe I'll ask you about Gordon Tullock and a few other things in a moment. But which is the bigger factor here, the driving behavior or the car choice to make it overall safer? Do you know?
If I had to pick something, if I had to pick something, I would go the behavior. And part of the reason is that it takes time to change the vehicle.
Mm.
So people, I mean, the average age of a vehicle is 10 years. And one of the issues that we have is that the safer vehicles tend to be driven by already the safer drivers. So the young people
Yeah.
tend to be in the older vehicles. And again, this is distorted relative to the UK because there's the lack of the incentive. So, but you can introduce telematics usage-based insurance to whatever vehicle you like.
Mm.
So it's not, you can put a mobile phone, you can have the mobile phone app working in whatever vehicle. So that's the easy win. So, and once someone's driving safely to the speed limit, not accelerating fast, braking fast, swerving, they are much, much safer. So I think that's the quick, easy, big win.
Hmm.
But yes, all those other things make a difference. You've touched on something which road safety people call the arms race on the roads, which is that
Mm.
if you're safer in a bigger car, but of course everyone else is not safer when you're driving a bigger car. So
Yeah, that's right.
it's it's called an arms race because effectively you want to be. If everyone else buys a bigger car, I'm encouraged to buy a bigger car myself to get safer, which then creates
Yeah.
everyone else incentive to get a bigger car.
We can't all have
Um,
the biggest cars. It's always relative.
yes,
Yeah,
and so
exactly.
that is an issue as well. And this is one, if we get the insurer incentives right, this one gets fixed automatically. We don't need additional regulation to address it all because that'll be priced into the insurance.
So let me throw it out there. If I'm a 20-year-old driver with an F-150 or a Dodge Ram in Australia, um, versus a 20-year-old driver in a Kia hatchback with lots of video cameras and airbags and safety features, what would be, do you know, like the ballpark difference in insurance price might be from a choice like that in an unregulated environment? Would it be $500 a year more? Like, what's the
I
ballpark of the numbers we'd be talking?
So I looked at the UK in this, and there was the discount for the safety discount for autonomous emergency braking, and this was back 7 years ago, where it was less
Hmm.
standard, was a few £100, I think it was,
A
per year.
year.
So,
So you're
hang on,
talking
actually,
500
I
bucks
could,
basically.
yeah.
Wow.
Actually, I might sort of look that up. I seem to, it was quite significant. But then you would get no such discounts here in Australia because the same
Yeah, yeah.
incentives aren't there. Yeah.
And then what about if you are a good driver in your telematics car, you've done a year and you're good. Are we talking another few $100 discount? Are we talking like $1,000 a year through your 20s, like $10,000 in your driving career saved in insurance if you just drive a slightly safer car and drive a bit smoother and more cautiously and not in the middle of the night? Is that the ballpark?
Uh, I I know it's sort of people talk about thousands of £1,000 type of saving for young drivers in the UK,
Wow.
but it
It's probably
I
a
mean
lot
it's
more.
all relative. I like to think of the total system cost, which is basically if you think about the total cost of putting vehicles on the road, what can we reduce that? And the if when I did my calculations of the social cost of road accidents, so we were talking around about I think it was high $20 billion per year in
Mm,
terms of social cost. And so
yeah.
and I think we can trim 20% off that.
Yeah.
if we can fix the insurance incentives. So we're talking billions of dollars of saving every year.
Yeah, so that's around 300 deaths, and remember they're roughly 10 million each. So what's that? 3 billion um, in just the cost of deaths, plus the 40,000 injuries is probably getting up there. So getting towards 20 billion a year, um, just in those little savings seems like a lot, right? That's the cost of WestConnex basically, but every year. Um,
It's absolutely massive, and I just find it gobsmacking that there isn't more attention put to this. In 2017, I actually wrote a paper trying to estimate the actual benefits of moving if we move to the UK system, um, and also then if we moved what I'd call the optimal system. So, by the way, we didn't touch on this, is that so the UK system's way better than Australia, but the
hmm,
UK still doesn't have it right because
okay.
they suffer from that problem that we talked about earlier, where the insurer's incentive is to reduce its financial liability, which is, way less than the optimal
Right.
societal incentive of, reducing, preventing fatalities. And so,
Ah,
so effectively, I think I worked out if we, I think it's a kind of a 2 to 3 times increase in the incentive for the insurers in the UK if they got that right. And
so
then you can imagine,
yeah.
yeah,
You're saying that the $9 million cost if I kill someone else on the road, the insurer is still only paying the $300,000 in
correct.
damages. So if the
And that
insurer had to pay 9 million, suddenly they're really paranoid about who's driving and what they're driving. Got it.
Absolutely. And it's a question of, you might ask what insurers would do, but probably the better question you'd ask, what wouldn't they do? They would fund road safety research. They would look at every safety device possible. Uh, and they would identify the high risks. They would target the high risks with the biggest incentives to improve their road risk. Um,
Yeah.
and they would do it much cheaper than any government program. I mean, you can ask what can a road police person do that an insurer can't do much more cheaply?
Hmm. Well, I guess the insurers could also just lobby main roads more effectively to overspend, spend $10 to reduce their cost by $1 on physical engineering. And maybe they do that to some degree already, but I want to get a little bit more on this. So I think I've got the incentives clearly. I want to sort of introduce some of the economics and the interesting um, trade-offs that happen in road safety. Is that you mentioned the arms race of bigger cars. So the more I protect myself from risk on the road, the more I can increase the risk to others because I've got the bigger car or whatever the case may be. Now, Gordon Tullock was a famous economist, and he said if you want the roads to be safe for others, instead of airbags to save you when you crash, you have a big spike sticking out of your steering wheel, aimed super sharp and aimed at your heart, so that if you crash, you die immediately. And he said people will stop crashing then because the incentive is right. They will not crash into other people. But now, because of airbags, you crash into someone else, you're safe and they're not. In a Tulloch spike situation, you crash into someone, you're dead, they're not. Um, how do road safety people think about these sort of, the risks coming from others on the road?
It's a beautiful bit of black humor, which just demonstrates the problem with the incentives. Yeah, it's obviously you would never suggest it, but it helps to focus the mind.
Yeah.
How do uh, how do others think about this? I got to admit, I feel like not enough. There is not enough focus on the incentives. Um,
Hmm.
the predominant thinking in the road safety sector right now is to think about what they call a safe systems approach, which is to look at um, the system that the people will drive under, which is all the roads, the speed limits, the regulations, etc., and think about basically how can we actually improve safety from every angle. it has I think, a lower focus on incentives than there
Mm,
should be. Interestingly, I haven't seen any discussion around the safe systems. It's meant to be holistic, but I haven't seen any discussion around safe systems around insurance regulation. So
yeah.
I think,
Right.
in short, the answer is to answer your question, is not enough. Um, how people are thinking around this.
Yeah. No, it's an odd one. For the economist to sit there and think, oh, you're spending X billion dollars on that safety upgrade when we only need it because people are not cautious enough. How do we make people more cautious? Now, the economist doesn't like sort of um, blanket regulations for all, but this sort of insurance-based approach seems to make a lot of sense. The example in China, I think, is interesting when it comes to incentives. I think when we first spoke, you mentioned it, but you can go to YouTube or wherever and see that it is often the case. I'm not sure if it's everywhere in China or currently or historically, that if you hit a pedestrian with your car and they live, that's bad. You want to actually reverse back over them and make sure they're dead because your incentive is if they're dead, you pay out less than if they're alive because you've got to cover their medical cost. Is that apocryphal or is that a true case of perverse incentives in road safety?
I've never heard of that example actually happening in real life, but the incentives there. I mean, it's truly awful that that's the situation, but that's exactly the situation happens all around Australia. The best thing I could do for my CTP insurer is, if I hit somebody, and rather than put them in a wheelchair for the rest of their life, is basically reverse back over them. And it's perverse. It's
Right.
just,
So you're saying
again,
then if
another
we
horrible bit of black humor.
so if I was self-insured, right, and I was personally liable, then I kill them, it's 300 grand. If I don't kill them, I pay them out their ongoing medical costs. I reverse back over them. So that's sort of a pure case. And what we're trying to do is separate that out, those incentives in a way that maximizes the preventative incentive all the way through the sort of insurance system. Is that
Well,
right?
fortunately, yes. Well, fortunately, from that incentive is passed on to the insurers, and so,
Mm,
and obviously
you're the
legal,
driver.
you're criminally liable if you do reverse back over them. But it's still, but yes, it's like it's an awful situation, and fixing it for the insurers would then give them the incentives then to influence you.
Yeah.
So it's
It's a strange one. I've got a few more questions, a little bit quirky and out there about this general topic before we wrap up. I think I've got a really good handle on where you're coming from, Richard. I want to ask you about um, licensing. So when I got my license, we had a 6 month learners, one test, no compulsory lessons. It was pretty straightforward. Now my son's getting his license. It's 100 hours. Your app, you have to register and track it in the app. You got to have at least 3 hours of professional lessons. You got to do a hazard perception test on the internet. You got to do all these road rule quizzes. Do we know if this filter on who becomes a driver, it's another sort of economic filter, has been really effective or not? And how would we know? Because I feel like I'm in the middle of this burdensome, costly process with my son. I want some reassurance from you that it's making us all safer, or do we not know? Please help.
yeah. So I've seen bits of research on this. What we have here in Australia, which is effective, the research certainly suggests it's effective, is graduated licensing. So this idea that you have your red P's and your green
Uh,
P's, um, and that there's limitations on what you can do for the first few years. That seems to work, and there's a variety of studies which suggest that works. So as to the 100 hours, I suspect that's there's a bit of overkill there, but I guess this is the problem in the road safety industry. There's no incentives for to optimize that burden versus
hmm,
the benefit. Um,
hmm,
I remember very early on the piece where you're sort of seeing that. Oh, I think where they worked out that if you traded some, instead of doing some of those on-road hours, you did some other type of activity, you would pretty much get the same sort of safety benefit. And I think that, and obviously, the more hours you do, there's diminishing benefit. But
Yeah.
I mean, Cameron, I think treasure it as time that you get to spend with your teenage child.
Yeah, we've had a lot of conversations in the car. It's a good chance to sit down together. But I do think you're right. Perhaps just having one afternoon on a skid pan doing some defensive driving and, you know, cutting loose on the wet road and recovering and things like that is probably per hour and dollar a huge benefit, but I don't want to give them more ideas for tacking on extra requirements just until both my kids have their license.
No,
Although I
but
suspect I might send them for something like that anyway.
the fortunate thing is that government, the time taken to introduce government programs, it's years, so you're pretty safe, unless you've got very young children.
Yeah. So I've got one more question about e-scooters. People seem to hate them. They think they're dangerous. They're clogging up the bike tracks. They're zooming past people. Are they kind of dangerous? I mean, I know in my neighborhood, a guy was killed on his e-scooter. He clipped a signpost because we do have a lot of signposts on the footpaths in Brisbane. Um, what's the basic scale of the risk on e-scooters? Do you know much about that?
No, unfortunately, going past my knowledge there.
Ah,
But I got to admit, yeah, I do worry about them. And I'd certainly worry about, people I care about being on them.
yeah, so I know a few emergency doctors, and they say it's the e-scooter's the greatest thing for business that we've had in the last decade. The
It's
number
awful.
of broken collarbones, wrists, arms, knees, deaths, and I find that quite odd, right? So we go to all these links to make roads safer, and then this e-mobility um, just comes along, and we all decide actually we like taking risks now. Let's jump on this drunk in the middle of the night and zoom down these hills in Brisbane. And the economist in me sort of says, well, your likelihood of killing someone else on an e-scooter is pretty low, so maybe I'm okay with you taking your own risks. Um, it's a little bit different than a motor car where you're sort of risking others more than yourself quite often in the cities. Anyway, that's just a bit of a rant. Last thing, economists like costs and benefits, right? We've talked about, you know, trying to kill fewer people, but what's that going to cost us in terms of moving around and mobility? Is it worth it?
Yeah. Uh,
Or do we
uh,
just adjust how we get that mobility? And in fact, the costs of minimal. How do you see that? The
okay.
scale
Well,
of cost.
I'll do one more plug for the insurance-based approach.
Okay.
If we get the insurance regulation right, we're going to reduce on-road costs. So effectively, the cost of, the cost of getting on the road and driving should come down. And then we can actually get rid of a lot of other regulatory burdens. I mean, I think this is particularly in the heavy vehicle industry. You'd sort of think, why not? You could some of the regulatory burdens there are quite stringent, and it would be far more efficient and effective to get the incentives right via the insurers. Yes,
Mm,
but to your question, um, ultimately, you get the incentives right, you get people make the right, you put the choices in with the people. They
yeah.
can, if you if you give them the right incentive to look after their safety and other people's safety, they can choose how much they drive and where they drive and what time they drive. So I'm generally in favour of pushing more decision making down to individuals because they know best their individual circumstances.
Yeah, no, I mean that's the classic economic approach. Last one, there was a proposal recently to lower speed limits somewhere in Australia, and it got a lot of pushback from, the freedom loving right on Twitter, at least. Um, Surely speed limits are really useful things. Do lower speed limits work in the cities? I mean, how should we think about the costs and benefits or the way risk changes with speed? when it
Absolutely.
comes to
So
this?
there clearly lower speed limits lead to lower injury and fatalities. So I think there's quite a bit of evidence on that, but also clearly there's costs involved. By the way, it does get a bit nuanced, and so there are sort of situations. There are other benefits of lowering speeds in some situations. You know, you can create these nice little neighborhoods where people are more
Mm,
using the street, and so people are more. The road becomes less of a barrier, and so
yeah,
that is very, very attractive. But it's very clear as well that there are costs associated with lowering speed limits, and they're well understood. And ultimately, there's a point. So, there's always the classic sort of, people sort of say, we should lower the speed limit to 30 kilometers an hour. And then someone will always retort, say, well, why
why
stop
not?
at 30? Why not go to 25 or 20?
Yeah,
We can save more lives if we go to 20. And it's a fair argument. You've got to accept that there are costs, and it's basically it's a nuance question. Reducing speed limits will be better and more effective in some places than others. Um, I think um, relative to alternatives, yeah, it's going to make sense in some situations. But gee, if I had to pick one thing to go with, I'm going to plug my
yeah.
again insurance reform.
Yeah, I mean, the trick with speed limits, once you get down to 30 Ks, people have, it's a guideline, but no one's really going under 30 Ks. It's surprisingly slow when you're in a car, unless there's a lot of traffic around. But as you say, they're also not intent like non-transport, car-related transport reasons to do that for street usage reasons and other things in certain pockets. And I think that's another economic lesson is we talk about all speed limits should be lower. No, in some areas where they're high value, they should be lower. And in other areas, just like insurance, the high risk people should pay more and the others shouldn't. We get back to that classic economic situation. So, look, we might have to wrap it up there, Richard. I really appreciate your time. And it sounds like that there are some relatively easy wins here for better aligning incentives in road insurance that by your estimates could sort of save 300 lives a year and 10 to 20 billion dollars worth of sort of avoided costs. um, but we just need to sort of think more about how to do that and overcome those political hurdles for deregulation and people facing their own risks and involving insurance and all those sort of economic things. Is that a reasonable summary? Or
I think
how would
it's
you
a
summarize
great,
it all?
great summary. I think the first step is just getting the discussion happening. And thank you for having me on your podcast because, that's a way of getting that message out there. I'm gobsmacked more journalists, politicians, road safety researchers aren't more interested in this topic of insurance reform because it's potentially a pot of gold and just we need a bit of investigation to investigate it.
Yeah, well, hopefully some listeners have some input, and maybe if you want to connect with Richard, please get in touch and I'll connect you. And yeah, we can get this conversation going a little bit more. Thanks for coming on, Richard.
Thank you so much, Cameron. All the best.
Thank you.